You've probably noticed that it's surprisingly difficult to log into things these days. I mean, websites and apps, some of them are easy, but a lot of them just seem really difficult. I mean, I work in this industry, I've built login systems, and I sometimes find that it takes me longer than I'd like to actually log into an account. I hear people tell me that they can't log on to things because they're not technically minded, that they don't really understand technology properly, and I actually don't think it's got anything to do with technology. I think the real reason it's so hard to log into things is that the users who are trying to log into things are actually the victims of this online struggle, almost like a war going on between system developers and hackers. And it's the moves and counter moves in this that really explain why things are difficult. So that's what I want to go through today, is I want to help you understand how we got into this situation where logging into things is just so frustrating. And if you find that it's frustrating, then let me know, like the video below, and let's get into it. The first passwords came about back in the early days of computing when it was largely a research tool for universities. And what you would initially have was a bunch of researchers who would build their software on punch cards. They'd hand their punch cards to a supervisor who would go into the room where the computer existed, plug the punch cards in, and then give the results back to the researchers. Eventually, though, computer systems grew and researchers wanted to use the computer directly and they didn't need to use punch cards. And so there needed to be a way for different users to log in and make sure that they could see their files and not someone else's files. A systems developer at MIT, a guy called Fernando Corbato, came up with this idea of passwords. The idea was you'd type in your username, you'd type in a secret phrase that only you knew, and because only you knew it, the computer knew it was you. Fast forward a bunch of years, and the system hadn't really changed, even though the way we'd used computers had changed. The internet was in the early stages of becoming a thing, and the idea of how you logged onto the internet was basically piggybacked on the same system. You'd have a modem, you'd dial up, you'd give it your username and password, and you'd log on to a server that was held at your internet service provider that was using the same password system. Then that computer would connect to the internet and send traffic back and forth on your behalf and gather your email. So there's a stereotype that a hacker is someone sitting in a dark room, quite possibly in their parents' basement. And actually, that's not an entirely inaccurate description of at least the early hackers. They were generally people who liked trying to figure out how bits of technology work. They liked figuring out how you could send clicks over the phone line to get free calls, or how to make VCRs do things they weren't meant to do. And the idea that they could get hold of someone's password was interesting to them. It was appealing. But ultimately, it wasn't that much of a big deal, because what could you do with it? Well, you could get access to free internet. It's not going to change the world. It's not going to be a serious problem. And most people, by and large, either didn't know this was happening or didn't care that it was happening. Sure, the internet service providers were possibly aware that someone was stealing some internet, but they had lots of people paying for the internet connection. It wasn't the biggest problem. And by and large, hacking at this stage was not seen to be much of a problem. Starting in the early 90s, shortly after the web was invented, there started to be a range of new online services. It started with online shopping. It went on to do a number of other things. I've actually done a whole video on that, which you can see up here. It was no longer enough just to log on to the internet. When Amazon appeared, you had to log on to Amazon. When eBay appeared, you had to log on to eBay. It's not just Amazon and eBay, but everything that was appearing on the internet at this time just copied the password idea. It didn't occur to them to stop and think, is that the right way to do it? And so we started to get this situation where you would need to log on to your Amazon account, to your eBay account, to your PayPal account, and for everything else that you wanted to do online, you'd need to log on to it. As a result of all of these online services, particularly online shopping services, it changed the dynamic for the hackers. No longer were they getting a little bit of free internet or just getting into someone's email just to see if they could. Now there were rewards on the table. If they could get hold of someone's password, if they could get into their account on an online shopping platform, then they could start getting physical stuff shipped to them. And so this community, who liked figuring out how technology worked, started to realize that they could get real financial gain. And it started to drive a range of different techniques of discovery about how you could get into these systems. And over time, people started to notice that, and it started to become a bit of a problem. For the first time, users found that they had to log in to multiple things. Up until now, they'd not really had to think about passwords. When you got a modem in the early days, you would just set it with your password once, forget about it, and probably not even remember that you had a password, let alone remember what the password was. Now the users were being asked to remember passwords to log into multiple different accounts on multiple different systems, Amazon, eBay, and so on. Most users picked a very simple strategy for this. They picked one password and they used it in every single site. They chose a password that was easy to remember. It could be the name of their child or something really simple like password or password1, which even today is still a shockingly common password. Hint, don't use password as your password. Now, a really big problem that happened here was a lot of the companies that were providing these online services that were allowing users to log in weren't really thinking with much detail about security. They weren't thinking, is this going to be a problem? They weren't thinking, how do I make sure that I'm taking my users' security seriously, partially because they're in the middle of the dot-com boom and every one of these businesses had 100 problems they were trying to solve and this simply wasn't the top of their agenda. And there hadn't been a huge wave of problems caused by not taking this seriously. As a result, the software developers working at these companies, the management at these companies, were all honestly a little bit asleep at the wheel. The hacking community realized a couple of things. They realized that more and more sites were going online where there was financial benefit if they could gain access to it, and they didn't even need to really crack the system. They just needed to pretend to be a valid user on that system. I'm talking about mostly online shops where you could buy stuff, but also some banks were starting to go online and a whole variety of different sites were going online, and many of them involved financial transactions of some form. So the hackers really started wanting to get really interested in this, and they also realized that the industry wasn't taking this very seriously. There were lots of ways that they could hack into systems. One of the most common ones is they would find one company that had fairly weak security because it didn't think it had much to lose if it got hacked. And then they would hack into that using some technical backdoor, maybe a piece of software that hadn't been updated or a known way of getting around a piece of security that hadn't been addressed in the company. And then they would just list all of the passwords on that site. That was something you could do. You could get access to a company's servers and download the password of everyone on that site. And so the hackers ended up armed with these large dumps of usernames and passwords. And then they would go to another site, a site that had better security, a site that was harder to hack into, and a site that was more valuable to hack into. And they didn't need to hack into it. They had passwords. They had thousands of passwords. And this became such a big thing that the hacking community went from being a community to being a large-scale, organized, industrial activity. You were no longer thinking about a single hacker. You were thinking about groups of hackers that had hundreds of members, thousands of computers, and were really pushing hard, trying to hack into any system, any user, because even the smallest issue, the smallest thing that they could get in and get some passwords would allow them to do all sorts of things. And this is the point that many people didn't realize for a long time. It was no longer hackers, it was now the hacking industry. And it really was an industry that grew and grew and grew. Eventually it came to the point where the industry had to start taking this seriously and had to properly pay attention to the threats of hackers and losing large amounts of data and money. It was now that the companies and the system developers working in those companies started to realize that they needed to take security a bit more seriously than they had been. And they looked at what had been happening and realized there were two areas where they needed to try and harden and try and protect the systems and what they were doing. That was making sure that the passwords they held on behalf of their users were secure so no one could break in and steal them, and making sure that if someone had got hold of a password for one of their users from some other site, that wouldn't be helpful and they couldn't get in that way. They made a couple of changes. The first was to protect the passwords they held, and they started paying a lot more attention to how hard it was to get into their systems, and they started encrypting the passwords so that even if you got into their database and you stole all their passwords, what you got was a chunk of garbage that you couldn't do anything with. This worked because when the user tried to log in, they could encrypt whatever password the user had given them and check to see if the two encrypted versions matched, and if they did, they must have been the same password. But if someone had stolen all of those encrypted passwords, they were pretty much useless. The second thing they wanted to do was make it harder for a hacker to get into their system using a valid password. And they did this a couple of ways. By introducing rules to the password that had two benefits. These are the rules you've probably seen, though. Your password must be 14, 16 characters long, whatever. It must contain numbers and special characters. This does a couple of things. The first is it makes it really difficult for you to use the same password on multiple sites, which means if someone has hacked into someone else's site and stolen your password, the password you have on a different site is probably different, and so the password doesn't help. And the other thing it does is it means you're less likely to be able to use a password that is easy to guess. For a computer system that is guessing 1,000 passwords, 10,000 passwords, or 100,000 passwords a second, this just made things worse for the user. All of a sudden they had to remember different passwords, and the passwords were things they couldn't remember. This became a real nightmare for users. A lot of them resorted to just keeping a note of all their passwords in a book, and so it's very common that you can find a book of passwords next to someone's computer. Or they couldn't remember their passwords, they thought they remembered their passwords, they tried having a system where they would have a basic idea of what their password was and then generate it based on some information about the name of the site. So they might have password as their default password and password Amazon for their Amazon password and password eBay for their eBay password. And more often than not, users forgot their passwords because it was a pain to remember them all. And then they had to spend half their life clicking on forgot password. So finally, the industry had started to pay attention. They'd started to make it harder for hackers to get into systems, steal passwords, and guess passwords. But that really didn't slow down the hackers. They just transitioned to tricking users into telling them their password. They started doing what's called a phishing attack, where they'd send an email pretending to be a system administrator, start a conversation, and the users would just hand over their password because they didn't realize. They would also resort to other techniques like sending attachments through emails, where if a user opened that file, then they would get access, they would be granting the hackers access to their systems. In short, it didn't really slow the hackers down. The industry had made some simple changes, but they hadn't really understood just how sophisticated and large scale the hackers had become, and so the changes didn't make much difference. There's one other thing that we need to address as well, which is it wasn't just hacking becoming institutionalized, large scale, and industrialized. It was also elevated to the level of international espionage and nation-state actors. This first hit the headlines in 2014 when Sony Pictures was hacked by North Korea. But it didn't stop there. These days, it's assumed that a significant number of hacks are done by one nation attempting to do something to another nation. They can do this through trying to hack influential people to gain access, or hacking of hundreds of people within a particular nation. It's certainly something we need to keep in mind, that it's now the people who are trying to hack pretty much everyone have the resources of national militaries behind them. It was about now that the industry really started to properly pay attention to security. They went back to the drawing board and started to think, how can we make this whole thing so much more secure? They came up with ideas like two-factor authentication. Two-factor because not just the password, you have to know something else or have access to some other way of verifying who you are. And that's where you see things like those 6-digit numbers that you get sent by a text message, which means you're proving you own the phone of the correct user, or by email, which means you're proving that you have access to the right user's email address. These are ways of making it much harder to log in if all you have is someone's password. That's also where you start to see the rise of biometrics. With a lot of computers and phones these days, you can log on with a thumbprint or with a Face ID. There's a few other ways you can do that, voice print or retinal scan. These also make it just a lot harder for someone to get into your system if all they've got is your password. So finally, the industry started properly paying attention and tried to make things secure. Well, some of these new password mechanisms and security systems work quite well. Fingerprints work great, apart from when they don't work. Face recognition works great, apart from when you change your glasses and they don't. But two-factor authentication, which is the whole thing with the code being sent to you, it can take minutes for the codes to turn up. Sometimes they don't turn up. Sometimes it's done through an app and the user can't find the app because the app's on their phone and the phone's in the other room, or they don't know where their phone is right now. And so not only are they struggling to remember passwords, because all of the previous password rules are still in place, but they're now unable to figure out where their phone is, and all they often want to do is just log in and order a new light bulb off Amazon or something. So from the user's perspective, it just got worse And worse. And worse. The industry is still thinking about how to do this better. They're aware that a lot of the ways that passwords work these days are cumbersome and slow users down, and so there's lots of experimentation around different ideas, things like passkeys, which are a new way of letting people log into systems. And it's still a bit of an experimental world. Like, there's different ways of making it possible to log into a system that in theory make it easier for users, but we need to wait and we need to find out whether they actually do make it easier for users, and how easy it is for the hacking entities that exist out there to bypass these systems and still gain access to things that they shouldn't gain access to. So there you have it. Logging into things hasn't always been that difficult. In the early days of computing, it was just you had a password, you had one password, you remembered it. And then it got harder. It got harder because hackers started to realize there was value in breaking into systems. It just took a while before the industry really started to take it seriously. So the industry's been playing catch up, the hackers have been rushing ahead, there's been moves and counter moves, and all of them have ended up just making the login system harder. Harder for the hackers, yes, but harder for the users as well. That's how we ended up in this state. So let me know in the comments, post a comment down below if you've had difficulty logging into things, or if you've tried any of the new systems, something like passkeys, and want to share your opinion on it. Ultimately though, security is always going to be this balance between trying to make it easy for the users and hard for hackers, which almost always makes it slightly harder for the users. So we're going to have to struggle through this for some time till someone invents a way that is completely secure and easy to use. So I appreciate you taking the time to understand this. I think it's an important topic and it shows you care about it. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.